The United Nations is not taking over the United States. The United States is being delivered to the United Nations. So let's shift gears now and let's talk about the United Nations. And I dare say I'm going to mention some things here that some people have never considered or never heard about, but let's move ahead anyway. Here's the UN headquarters in New York, and it's built on land donated by the Rockefeller family, which says something, but we won't have time for that. All throughout the course of history, there have been people who wanted to build a world government. The first of them was in the book of Genesis. You can go to the book of Genesis and read about the Tower of Babel, where people wanted to build a world government, and God intervened. And what happened is that there were people who could speak a language now, with some but not all, and they went off and formed a nation. Other people could speak another language, another one here, another one there, and so forth. In other words, the beginning of nationhood was at the Tower of Babel. And therefore, nationhood is good, and world government is not, if you have that religious sense. The goal of world government has been going on for the last couple of hundred years. Adam Weishaupt and his Illuminati conspiracy that started in 1776. He was succeeded by Giuseppe Mazzini, who formed the Carbonari, and young Italy, young Germany, young France, young this, young that, and young America. We can't ignore that. Karl Marx in 1848, Communist Manifesto, and of course, they called it the Communist Manifesto. They wanted to call it the Socialist Manifesto, but they didn't because there were some screwballs running around calling themselves socialists, so they changed the attitude. But communism and socialism is the same, right? And then Edward Mandell House, President Wilson's chief advisor, who wrote a famous book in 1912 called Philip Drew Administrator. In it, he called for world government. But he also called for a Federal Reserve, and he called for an income tax, and he called for a lot of things that we have today, and he was successful. Well, what happened is that Edward Mandell House's book turns out to have a dedicatory quote from Giuseppe Mazzini, which is very significant. Right? He was the top advisor to Wilson and FDR. He saw it in his book. He said he was working for socialism as dreamed of by Karl Marx. That lays out the whole program. He despised the U.S. Constitution, wanted to see it obliterated. He advocated the income tax, the Federal Reserve. He proposed world government, and he launched the Council on Foreign Relations. I can't get into discussing that except to say that that's a key to understanding why our country is in trouble today, to understand the Council on Foreign Relations. At the end of World War I, there was a proposal introduced by President Wilson with House's prodding to have the United States join a League of Nations. Well, the senators debated that for 9 full months and said no. Thank goodness, right? They said no. And so the League of Nations was actually formed. It did exist for a time. And when it finally closed its doors in 1947, it gave all its assets to the UN. So remember now, it took 9 months to debate that in 1919, and they said no. We'll get to later on how the vote on the UN was changed. All right, now, here we have Pearl Harbor. This is a crisis, obviously, and if you know Rahm Emanuel's famous remark, a crisis is a terrible thing to waste, right? So they didn't waste it. What they did immediately was get into the war, and 1 month after Pearl Harbor, 26 nations issued a formal declaration of the United Nations. They started using the term within a month of Pearl Harbor. In 1943, Allied nations met. That was the U.S., the United Kingdom, USSR, and China, and they agreed to form a world government. In 1944, there was the famous Dumbarton Oaks Conference in Washington, D.C., and they issued an initial draft of the UN Charter. In 1945, the San Francisco Conference, 50 nations participated, and they produced the final UN Charter. Right? Even before the war had been finished, they had done this. Right? The war ended in August. This happened in July. Now, who was the Secretary General of the founding conference at the United Nations in San Francisco? His name was Alger Hiss. He was later found to have been a secret communist the whole time. Right? The other author with Hiss was Andrei Gromyko of the USSR. So the two chief authors of the UN Charter were an open communist from the Soviet Union and a secret communist from the United States. Right? The U.S. delegation at the UN founding, there were 16 secret communists who were people who gathered to form the United Nations Charter along with Hiss. Now, I have a packet of information back there. I get through this talk and people say to me, I can't remember all that stuff. Did you bring any? Did you bring any documentation? So I brought a packet of information back there. It has the UN Charter. It has all this kinds of stuff. I'll refer to some of these things. The delegation that we sent to San Francisco in 1945, there were 43 persons on that delegation who either were or would become members of the Council on Foreign Relations. Right? So you can see the whole thing was pretty much... So then the U.S. Senate got to vote on whether or not we get into the UN. Remember now, 9 months to decide no in 1919 to the League of Nations, but they debated the matter for 6 days in 1945, and they said yes. They approved UN membership in the UN by a vote of 89 to 2. Only 2 senators said no. Now, why was that? Well, I'm old enough to remember that period. Right? I remember in 1945 that there were people who were saying, look, we had a World War I, and only less than 25 years later, we had World War II. We got to do something different. We got to try something new. Right? And that's the way the attitude was spread throughout the United States about joining the United Nations. So even my own father was saying that, and he was quite a patriot. But he said, yeah, let's give it a go. Let's give it a try. So 89 to 2 was the vote. Who were the 2? All right? Henrik Shipstead of Minnesota and William Langer of North Dakota. 2 names you've all heard of, I'm sure. Right? Someday we're going to elect a monument to these 2 somewhere. Right? Now, there was a California senator named Hiram Johnson, and he would have voted no, but illness kept him from participating, and he died soon after that. All right, here's the Charter of the United Nations. And here's a copy of it that's in this packet. Now, I know that there are not that many Americans who have ever read the U.S. Constitution. And there are even fewer who have read the UN Charter. Right? So here it is, and you can see it's not a very big document. In fact, it's not as big as the Constitution, I don't think. Right? But the U.S. Constitution... Now, let's talk about the Charter of the UN. Article 1, the word peace appears 6 times. Right? And so the UN's always been called a peace organization. Right? But Article 2 discusses the application of enforcement measures under Chapter 7. Right? A peace organization with enforcement measures? Isn't that a little bit of an oxymoron? Right? So we go to Chapter 7, and what do we see? That Chapter 7 authorizes the United Nations Peace Organization to create demonstrations, blockades, and other operations by air, sea, or land forces of the United Nations. So they have the authority in the UN Charter to conduct war. And there was a famous American who said that he had read the UN Charter, and he said, this is not a peace charter, this is a war charter. And he was absolutely right. All right, so now the source of UN's military forces comes in Article 43 of the UN Charter. Right? It says all members of the United Nations undertake to make available to the Security Council armed forces, assistance, and facilities, including the rites of passage necessary for the purpose of maintaining international peace and security. Right? Again, an oxymoron. A peace organization doing this kind of stuff? Well, no. All right, now, this to me is the most egregious part of the UN Charter. Just consider you're a United States senator in 1945, and you're asked to vote whether or not our country should join the United Nations. All right? And you get to Article 25. This is the entire Article 25. All right? Read along with me. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. Ladies and gentlemen, that trumps the Constitution of the United States, right? And that any senator would put his name to that deserves to be slapped around, at least, or maybe voted out of office, right? But there it is. The members of the United Nations agree to accept and carry out the decisions of the Security Council in accordance with the present charter. Incredible. Only 2 saw that. Now, so we joined the United Nations in the summer of 1945, even before World War II had ended. In December of 1945, Congress passed the United Nations Participation Act. And we have a folder here that explains this in detail, the United Nations Participation Act. Right? There's 2 parts of it. Part 1 says that the President of the United States must have approval of Congress to supply troops for a UN standing army. The UN has always wanted its own army. It never has had one, right? But if it decided that it wanted a standing army, the President of the United States would have to go to Congress to get approval to put some of our troops in that UN standing army. But look at Part 2. Part 2 says the President shall not be deemed to require the authorization of Congress to send troops to enforce Security Council resolutions. All right? So there's what's been happening. We've done that over and over again, Part 2. Now, the reason that one of the things in the packet is a copy of H.R. 1146 introduced by Congressman Ron Paul, who has repeatedly in Congress after Congress after Congress introduced this very same bill to get us out of the United Nations. And the very beginning of it says, Section 2, repeal the United Nations Participation Act. Right? But how many in this room have ever even heard of the United Nations Participation Act? Right? It is so key. It's why we're there. The House approved that bill 344 to 15. Right? The 344 ought to be slapped around a little too. Right? The Senate approved it by voice vote, and it became part of the law. And it is why the President can do what he does with the military forces of the United States. Now, Senator Robert Taft was the greatest American at the time, way back in the 40s. Robert Taft was known as Mr. Republican. Right? He voted for our entry into the United Nations, and he regretted it very soon after. He said the UN has become a trap. Let's go it alone. Right? A good attitude. He was very, very sorry that he had put his name on approval of the United Nations. Right? Now we move ahead. The UN's in business, and we get to the 1949 period when we see Secretary of State Dean Acheson promoting the idea of us forming NATO, North Atlantic Treaty Organization. Right? He said NATO is an essential measure for strengthening the United Nations. Right? Right? Well, what about NATO? What is NATO? Well, if you go to Article 52, 3, and 4 of this UN Charter, you see authorization there for creating a NATO, and then a CETO, and then some other groupings and so forth. The UN Charter says the Security Council shall utilize such regional arrangements for enforcement action under its authority. So any NATO operation is under UN authority and enforcing the provision. Now, we were all told that NATO was formed to prevent Soviet Union from taking more countries in Europe moving to the West after they had already seized Eastern Europe, right? That's what we were told, right? Well, I remember being told when I was little that there was an Easter Bunny, right? And a Tooth Fairy, and some other things, right? That's not why. Go back to what did Acheson say? It's essential for strengthening the United Nations. Right? I have here the NATO handbook. Right? There's a tremendous amount of information in here that's very condemnatory, in my view, put out by NATO. Right? So there it is. All right, so what do we see? We see that they formed these regional organizations. Now we're going on in time. 1 year after NATO was formed in 1949, we had the Korean War. Started in June 1950. Right? North Korea invaded South Korea. The UN Security Council says all members send forces. Right? How many nations sent forces? Well, a couple of others besides ours, but the bulk of the forces were from the United States, right? President Truman, he knew that he was on shaky ground here. So he would tell the press, we are not at war, this is a police action. If I can send troops to NATO, he said, I can send troops to Korea. And you can see using that precedent, right? So UN flags were actually flying during that war in 1951, 2, and 3. Right? And the state of war in Korea still exists. It has never ended. Right? There was a truce in 1953. But we still have 35,000 troops in South Korea. We're supposedly defending South Korea from an invasion of North Korea. And South Korea has become such an industrial power that they're now selling automobiles in the United States, right? And a lot of other things besides. I mean, a lot of things are upside down. So they had the Korean War under obvious UN domination, and we could have won it on 2 separate occasions, and both times they took it away from us. Well, then, shortly after that, they formed another regional arrangement under the UN Charter, CETO. And we sent troops to South Vietnam under CETO. Well, President Lyndon Johnson in 1967, he was asked, well, how did we get into there? How did we get into Vietnam? What's this all about? Here's what he said. We are in Vietnam because the United States and our allies are committed by the CETO Treaty to act to meet the common danger of regression in Southeast Asia. CETO, Southeast Asia Treaty Organization, exactly the same as NATO, except for a different part of the world. Right? So the Vietnam War fought under overall United Nations? Absolutely. President Johnson even told us. Right? So in 1991, we go to Desert Storm. All right? The President George W. Bush, the Gulf crisis has to do with a new world order. How many times did he say that? Over and over and over again. And that new world order is going to be enhanced if this newly activated peacekeeping function of the United Nations proves to be effective. So we went to war in Desert Storm. And then the war ended suddenly. Right? The war ended suddenly. Why did it end suddenly? Because the UN Security Council authorized only forcing Iraq's troops out of Kuwait. Once they were out of Kuwait, it stopped. And a lot of people said, why didn't they go on to Baghdad? Why didn't they go get Saddam Hussein? Why didn't they just turn that whole thing upside down? The reason was that the United Nations Security Council authorized only that they get the troops out of Kuwait. Right? Now, this is very interesting, and to me it's always been infuriating to even talk about this. All right? Desert Storm happened in March of 1991. No, excuse me. We're talking now about the next Iraq war. The next Iraq war started in March of 2003. The one that we're still in, right? Started in March of 2003. 6 months before that, the House International Relations Committee met. Congressman Ron Paul's a member of that committee. Mr. Chairman, I have a motion. I move that we declare war on Iraq. And I intend to vote against my measure because I don't think we should go to war against Iraq. But I also don't think we should ignore the constitutional requirement for a congressional declaration of war. Right? All right? Chairman of the committee. I sworn an oath to the Constitution, just like Ron Paul. All of them have. Right? Chairman Henry Hyde. He responded to Ron Paul. He said, there are things in the Constitution that have been overtaken by events, by time. Declaration of war is one of them. There are things no longer relevant to a modern society. Your measure is inappropriate, anachronistic. It isn't done anymore. Imagine. So the committee voted, canceled Ron Paul's motion, and we went to war 6 months later. Right? Now, I had some friends in Chicago area where Henry Hyde is from, and I said to him, please write him a letter and ask him if the portion of the Constitution that says he should be paid a salary is anachronistic. Right? They did, and they didn't get any answers. Right? But that actually happened. Right? Okay, so here's the wars after World War II. Korean War, obvious UN control, and it's still under UN control. The Vietnam War was under SCATO. That's UN. Desert Storm 1991 was authorized by the Security Council. Okay. Iraq War, 2003 it started. It's still going on, authorized by the Security Council. The Afghanistan War started in 2001, and it still goes on. That's under NATO, right? So am I saying that our military is pretty much doing the will of the United Nations? Maybe even under the control of the United Nations? Yes. Yes, I'm saying that. The United Nations passes out all kinds of information about itself, how wonderful it is, and so forth. And here's their flow chart. Now, you can't read that, and you could possibly read it when you get the packet. It's one of the things in the packet. But what does it say? Well, it says that the United Nations has bureaus, commissions, and activity involved in the following, okay? Education, population, children, women, environment, trade, finance, health, agriculture, labor, military science, culture, atomic power, telecommunications, aviation, industrial development, narcotics, refugees, property rights, and more. Ladies and gentlemen, the United Nations is into everything, right? Now, I'm focusing mostly on the military aspect. I want to make that point very clear. The United Nations is into everything, and it means to dominate everything. All right, now, you can get a sense of the United Nations. You go to the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is something that they tout, they're very proud of, and everything else. And it talks about all the rights that we talk about in our Bill of Rights. Freedom of speech, freedom of press, freedom of assembly, and so forth. But there's a difference. In the exercise of his rights and freedoms, everyone shall be subject only to such limitations as are determined by law. What does the U.S. Constitution say? Congress shall make no law. What a huge difference, right? What a huge difference. These rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. There you have it, right? Universal Declaration of Human Rights? No. If the UN should take control, you will have no rights. Nobody will, right? Okay? United Nations, rights are granted but subject to limitations. The U.S. Bill of Rights, rights are God-given, and Congress shall make no law. You couldn't be more different, right? Here's the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. This was put out by the UN in 1966, right? And it's the same thing all over again, right? Recognizing these rights derived from the inherent dignity of the human person. No, no, no. The Declaration of Independence of the United States said we are endowed by our Creator with certain unalienable rights, not what they say, all right? Realizing that the individual having duties to other individuals is under responsibility to strive for the promotion and observance of the rights recognized in the present charter. Well, what are some of the rights in the present charter? Same thing, all over again. Right? Rights are granted, but subject to limitations. In our system, rights are there. Congress shall make no law. Okay, so what do we do about the United Nations? Well, let's make a few conclusions. All right? The United Nations is not taking over the United States. The United States is being delivered to the United Nations. Right? Do you get the distinction there? Right? Right? So the problem really isn't the United Nations as much as it is our own leaders who are doing this. And that's a very important consideration. Right? Conclusion number 2. Membership in the United Nations is completely incompatible with the maintenance of independence for the United States and the freedom for the American people. Completely incompatible. There's no middle ground. Right? Conclusion number 3. Should we reform it, the United Nations? No, you'll hear proposals to reform the United Nations. Should we simply reduce some payments to the UN? We pay 22, 25% of all the expenses, right? The answer to that is no, don't reduce payments. Should we find a friendlier Secretary General to be the chief of the United Nations? And again, the answer is no. So what is the answer? It's down at the bottom of the thing. Get us out, right? Get us out of the United Nations, and then get the United Nations out of the United States. And finally, that huge building down in New York City, we'll convert that into the international headquarters of the John Birch Society. Thank you very much.